So this is going to be a video just talking about what is the iconic weapon for Siege. You look at Counter-Strike, you have the AWP and the AK as the go-to weapons. You see them in 90% of the highlight clips. You look at Call of Duty, you have the intervention or whatever. Sniper, AR is kind of the primary weapon for that entry. And if you look at Titanfall, or the other one, you have the Wingman. And so one thing that kind of tends to be a constant across all of first-person shooters is that you tend to have these iconic weapons that almost represent the essence of what that game or that franchise kind of is, what they play like, what matters. And so I got thinking, what is Siege's iconic weapon or loadout? Do we even have one? Because it seems like a really simple question at first. You just go, oh, well, fucking, what are the gunner guns? What are the gunner guns that are used in all the highlights? And then you stop and think about that, and you realize the gunner guns depend on the meta, depend on the era, because Ubisoft's balancing would often move and shift players along from one fragging op to another based on who was buffed, who was nerfed, and who was like something in the middle. Now, obviously, this topic is also very much complicated by the fact that loadouts are, for the most part, unique to operators, especially during the early years. You know, if you had Thermite, he had the American Shoddy and he had the 5.56, and that's all he had. No one else had that. It's not until years and years later down the line where we started having data restrictions and just kind of, you know, limits to how many cool guns we can add to the game, let's be honest here, that we start having repeats where Osa has the 5.56, Amaru has the SMG-11, you know? Like, we're getting repeats of these weapons. So, you know, if you talk about year one, year two, you go, oh, who are the fragging ops, and what guns do they use? And you look at that, you say 416 with an ACOG, MP7 with an ACOG, you could even throw the SMG-11 with an ACOG in there, R4C with an ACOG, and those would all be valid answers. Like, you slap NDK, you slap Eunice, you slap Bibu on Ash and Jaeger, and you watch them tear heads off, and that's just what they do. But in year 4, Jaeger no longer has the ACOG. Ash, for year 4, I don't think Ash has the ACOG on the R4C. All of a sudden, Zophia's in the mix. You know, you've had Ella rise and fall. You've had all these operators kind of come in, come out. Once the 1.5 enters the fold, you start having this topic of like, well, what is the meta gun? That depends on the time of a month, honestly, because Ubisoft keeps adding and subtracting the 1.5 from one operator to another. You know, sometimes it's Wabai, sometimes it's Mozzie, sometimes it's friggin' like Mute with the MP5K, and then it's gone again. And you're like, well, where's the consistency? How can it be an iconic weapon if it's in and out and in and out? That's not an iconic weapon. That's just a flow of the meta. Does Siege even have an iconic weapon? Because the balancing adjustments made to the game have really limited what you could think of as the iconic weapon, because there's not really something that's consistent throughout all the years. But anyways, I figured I'd talk about what some of the candidates for Siege's iconic weapon might be, because I think there's a few different directions that you can go. And, you know, I've hinted at it already, but I think the go-to for a lot of people, especially if they think about highlight clips as what makes a weapon iconic for a title, they'll lean towards two main weapons, the R4C and the 416. Of course, you gotta go for the classic Ash Jaeger weaponry, because for the longest time, and arguably even nowadays, Ash, and to a lesser extent Jaeger, are still like the premier fraggers of the game. Jaeger less so. Poor guy's been hit with a nerf hammer one too many times, but like, especially with your ACOG back on it, the R4C is that go-to weapon. You think of the classic Bolo clips, you think to like classic clutches, Cantor Rocketti on Coastline, for example. What weapon are they using? They're using the R4C. It's the highlight machine, the entry player that's gonna take 4 heads off. You know, that's who you're looking at. That's the gun that you're looking at for all those clips. and that's always a good shout. The 416 to a lesser extent, since Ubisoft has a fucking hate boner for Jaeger, but like that's not even his fault. It ain't even his fault anymore. He's suffered enough, please. The Brits also have a pretty good case that they have the iconic weapons of Siege, which is interesting because when you think of a weapon like the L85 or the SMG-11, they don't come up that often in other titles, or even if they do, they aren't prominent. You know, the L85 or some variant of it was in Battlefield 3, for example. You know, I've spent many an hour in Operation Lockers 24/7. I loved using the L85, but I didn't get that love from Battlefield. That love came from using the L85 in Siege and then going, oh, cool, they have this gun in Battlefield, right? And for the longest time, the L85, Sledge and Thatcher were two integral operators for the history of Siege. You know, Sledge was this super flexible. He's never a bad pick, thanks to his kit. The L85's a low recoil, consistent fire rate, consistent damage gun. He's got the SMG-11 as a secondary, right up until he doesn't, but he's got the SMG-11 as a secondary. He comes with frag grenades. The Sledgehammer is great for vert, for soft destruction. He's just super flexible. He's never a bad pick for the attacking lineup. Likewise, Thatcher, for the longest time, was viewed as this very, very useful operator if you want to open a wall, and hard breaching, for the longest time, determined the flow of Siege as a game. So, of course, denying the hard breach denial of like Bandit and Mute and later down the line Cade, denying that kind of equipment is essential. So Thatcher's always going to be high priority as well. And he also has the L85. He also has the AR-33, but it just doesn't feel right, you know? So we get the L85, right? The L85, the SAS operators are super, super meta for a very, very prolonged period of time. They're just present. You see a lot of clips with them. The Sledgehammer is the most iconic gadget in Siege because it's the hammer for our world championships. And what weapon does the guy with the hammer use? It's the L85. So you can kind of build this case that like, hey, maybe it's the L85. Shout out to G from the GGE for mentioning the L85. But on the other side of the coin, particularly if we're talking defense, the other British operators have built a really good case for the SMG-11, particularly when used in the SMG-11 shotgun combo. And the reason I mention this is because I think the loadout of the SMG and the shotgun honestly make this the perfect representation. This is my personal pick for what the iconic weapon or loadout really should be for Siege. Because the SMG-11 is this secondary machine pistol. It's got 17 bullets. It's got a decent amount of kick, particularly nowadays. It didn't used to, but it takes a little bit of mastery to get used to compared to other weapons on the field. It's got a low magazine, high fire rate. In theory, it can shred anyone in a 1v1. But it takes mastery to use, and it's dangerous to use for multiple engagements at once because of the low magazine count. You also have the Mossberg, which the Mossberg is perfect for site reconstruction, for close quarters combat. And I really can't emphasize that site reconstruction enough. Part of the reason why Smoke and later down the line Mute were so essential to defensive lineups for a lot of Siege's lifetime was that there weren't many other operators on the defensive roster that had a shotgun of any kind, or if they did, they didn't have a suitable secondary or primary weapon that could be used in conjunction with it to justify that shotgun being brought. As much as we all respect players like Hungry for picking the shotgun with Ying, it's just not a consistently reliable loadout to bring to the table. And so Mute and Smoke, later down the line Mira, when they had these secondary shotguns, that was lineup defining. That was defining the lineup because you need to reconstruct the site, and impact nades help. But impact nades don't make head holes. Impact nades don't make feet holes. A shotgun really factored into things, and the SMG-11 on Smoke and on Mute really defined the defense. This loadout literally defined all of defense, and you know it's only recently thanks to the fact that, Legion has a super shorty, Castle has a super shorty, Mira has a ITA, Frost has an ITA. All these defenders getting these secondary shotguns, the Bailiff, all of these defenders getting these shotguns actually kind of dilutes that essence, which is fair. But for the longest time, Mute and Smoke were like the defining operators of the defense, just like Thatcher and Thermite were the defining operators of the attack, because they had to be. You had to bring a Thatcher Thermite to the attack to open up the reinforced walls, because you had to open up the reinforced walls so that you could actually run your game plan, run your win conditions on the attack, on the defense. You can't set up a site without a shotgun, so you have to bring it. Who's taking the hit? Well, who has the secondary SMG? It's Smoke. It's Mute. The SMG-11 and the Shotty combo really represent Siege well, because not only is it like a unique weapon combination, you don't see the SMG-11 and the shotgun, particularly not as a combination, in any other game. This is solely unique to Siege. It's not like seeing the ACR in both X-Defiant and COD and whatever. It's not like seeing the AWP and then some AWP equivalent in Valorant, right? The SMG-11 shotgun combo is exclusive to Siege. That makes it interesting, and it also represents the gameplay because of the site reconstruction, because of caliber-based destruction, because of customizing your kit, literally like optimizing it strategically so that you can reconstruct sites, so that you can take some long-range fights at the same time while also providing this team utility with a shotgun. Being this close-range specialist, but also, if you're really forced into it, that SMG can take off heads if you're accurate enough at long range. I think there's something to that other weapons don't really represent. So if I had the keys to the castle and I got to define what the most iconic weapon in Siege was, I would say it was the SMG-11. Expanding a little broader, I would say it's the SAS operators with their loadouts in general, because you have the Mossberg, the SMG-11, and the L85. Runners up, you got the R4C and the 416, and if you expand a little beyond that, maybe you can argue like the P10 Roni is one of those classic gunner guns at this point in time, because it's just been so long. But yeah, what do you think are the iconic weapons of Siege? What comes to mind when you think of the iconic loadouts or weaponry from this game? Because it really is a very interesting question, thanks to the fact that every operator has their own weaponry, their own loadout. This really complicates things.